The Bible mentions giants 30 times, but most Christians only know about Goliath. What if I told you there were entire races of giants that God specifically commanded to be wiped out? And what if some of them might have survived? The truth about biblical giants is far more terrifying than you've been taught. Most people think giants in the Bible were just tall humans. They're wrong. Genesis chapter 6 reveals something happened before the flood that created beings called Nephilim. These weren't normal people. The Hebrew word Nephilim means fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. But here's where it gets strange. Numbers 13:33 says the Israelite spies saw Nephilim in the Promised Land. Wait! Didn't the flood kill everyone except Noah's family? So how were giants still alive after the flood? The Bible gives us clues, but most churches never talk about this mystery. The Nephilim origin. Let's start with the most famous giants that nobody really understands. The Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 says something shocking. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Who were these sons of God? Some say they were the descendants of Seth, but the Hebrew text suggests something darker. These sons of God weren't human. They were divine beings who left their proper place. The result? Their children became mighty warriors of old, men of renown, but these weren't heroes. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall violently. These giants were violent, corrupt, and filled the earth with wickedness. They were so evil that God regretted making mankind at all. The book of Enoch, which Jude quotes in the New Testament, gives us more details. It says these fallen angels taught humans forbidden knowledge, how to make weapons, how to use makeup, how to read the stars. They corrupted everything God had made pure. Their giant children grew to enormous sizes. Some ancient texts say they were 300 cubits tall. That's over 400 feet. Even if we use the smaller royal cubit, we're talking about beings 15 to 20 feet tall. They ate everything. When food ran out, they started eating humans. So God sent the flood to wipe them out completely. Every giant died. Every Nephilim was destroyed. The bloodline was cut off forever. Or was it? Here's where the problem keeps scholars awake at night. Numbers 13:33 clearly states that the Israelite spies saw Nephilim in Canaan. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. How is this possible? The flood killed everything that breathed air. Noah's family were the only humans who survived. So how were giants still alive after the flood? The Bible gives us clues, but most churches never talk about this mystery. The Enochim, giants of Canaan. The first giant race Israel encountered in the Promised Land was the Enochim. Their name means long-necked ones, or those who wear necklaces. They were descendants of a man named Enoch, whose father was Arba. A giant named Arba built the city of Hebron. The Bible calls Arba the greatest man among the Enochim. If he was the biggest giant in a race of giants, imagine how huge this man was. The Enochim were so terrifying that 10 of the 12 Israelite spies refused to enter the Promised Land. These were men who had seen God part the Red Sea. They watched fire come down from heaven. They ate bread that appeared from nowhere every morning. But when they saw the Enochim, they lost all faith. Numbers 13:28 records their exact words. The people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Enoch there. Notice, they mention the cities were built to accommodate these giants. We're not talking about normal-sized people living in giant cities. These cities were built by giants for giants.
Deuteronomy 9:2 describes them this way. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them, and have heard it said, "Who can stand up against the Anakites?" This had become a common saying in Israel. Nobody could fight the Anakites and win. But here's what's interesting. The Anakim weren't just one family. They had spread throughout the land and formed three main clans: Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Each name has a specific meaning that tells us about their nature. Keep watching, because I'm about to reveal which giant bloodlines are mentioned in the New Testament, and they might still exist today. The evidence will shock you. The Rephaim, the fearsome dead. The Rephaim were another race of giants, but their name reveals something disturbing. Rephaim means the dead ones, or the departed spirits. Some scholars believe they were called this because they were so connected to death and the underworld. Genesis 14 mentions them during Abraham's time. They lived in a place called Asher-Taroth Karnaim. King Chedorlaomer defeated them in battle, which means they were already established as a major force in the region. But here's what's interesting. The Anakim weren't just ancient history. They were still around during Israel's conquest of Canaan. Deuteronomy 3:11 tells us about King Og of Bashan, who was the last of the Rephaim. His iron bed was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. That's about 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Think about that. The bed was 13 feet long, but beds are usually a bit longer than the person sleeping in them. So Og was probably around 11 to 12 feet tall. And he wasn't just tall, he was broad and powerful. His bed was made of iron because no wooden bed could support his weight. The Valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem was named after these giants. Even today, you can visit this place and see where these massive beings once lived. But they weren't just living there, they were buried there too. Job 26:7 says something chilling. The dead tremble, those beneath the waters and all that live in them. The Hebrew word for dead here is Rephaim. It suggests these giants had some connection to the spirit world even after death. Psalm 88:10 asks, "Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do the Rephaim rise up and praise you?" Again, the Hebrew uses Rephaim for the dead. There's something about these giants that connected them to death itself. But the giant problem wasn't limited to Canaan. East of the Jordan River lived two more giant races, the Emim and the Zamzummim. Deuteronomy 2:10 describes the Emim. The Emim used to live there, a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. The name Emim means terrors or fearful ones. They were so frightening that their very name meant terror. The Moabites were so afraid of them, they wouldn't even use their real name. They had to call them something else. The Zamzummim were another giant race. They lived east of Israel in a place called Ammon. The Bible says they were just as tall and strong as the Anakim, but the local people were so scared of them, they gave them a different name. Zamzummim means plotters or schemers. These weren't just big, dumb brutes. They were intelligent, cunning giants who could plan and strategize. That made them even more dangerous. But here's what's remarkable. God didn't just ignore these giant races. He actively helped destroy them. Deuteronomy 2:21 says, "But the Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place." God was systematically removing giant bloodlines from the earth. He gave their lands to human nations and helped wipe them out completely. Or did he?
Goliath's family tree. Everyone knows about Goliath, but most people don't know he had brothers, and they don't know his family history goes back to the earliest giant races in the Bible. 1 Samuel 17 introduces Goliath as a champion named Goliath who was from Gath, but 2 Samuel 21 reveals he had at least 4 relatives who were also giants. After David killed Goliath, Israel continued fighting his family. 2 Samuel 21:16 mentions Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha. Rapha is connected to the Rephaim, the same giant race we talked about earlier. This giant carried a bronze spear weighing 300 shekels and wore new armor. He planned to kill David, but Abishai saved the king. Then there was Sop, another descendant of Rapha. Sibbecai the Hushathite killed him at Gob. The text makes it clear these weren't isolated incidents. Israel was fighting an entire family of giants. The most interesting is the giant mentioned in 2 Samuel 21:20. In still another battle, which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was a descendant of Rapha. 6 fingers and 6 toes. This wasn't just a random birth defect. This was a genetic marker. Something in the giant bloodline caused this specific trait. And it wasn't just one person. It was a family characteristic. 1 Chronicles 26 gives us more details about this 6-fingered giant. In still another battle, which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. He also was descended from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimeath, David's brother, killed him. But here's what most people miss. Goliath himself was from Gath. The 6-fingered giant was also from Gath. This wasn't a coincidence. Gath was a giant stronghold where these bloodlines lived and multiplied. The Philistine connection. The Philistines weren't originally giants, but they became the home for surviving giant bloodlines. After Israel conquered most of Canaan, the remaining giants fled to Philistine cities. Joshua 11:22 tells us exactly what happened. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. These were all Philistine cities. The giants didn't disappear, they regrouped. This explains why the Philistines became Israel's greatest enemy. They weren't just another Canaanite tribe. They were harboring the surviving members of the giant races that God had commanded Israel to destroy. Gath became especially important. It was the home of Goliath and his family. But archaeological evidence suggests Gath was built to accommodate much larger people than normal humans. The doorways, stairs, and foundations all suggest inhabitants much taller than average humans. But the Philistines made a fatal mistake. They didn't just give the giants shelter, they made them their champions. When Israel and Philistia went to war, the Philistines sent out their giants as representatives. They thought these massive warriors would terrify Israel into submission. They were wrong. David killed Goliath with a single stone. His brothers killed the other giants one by one. By the end of David's reign, the giant bloodlines that had terrified Israel for generations were finally extinct. Or were they? Most Christians don't realize the New Testament mentions giants too, but they're hidden in the Greek text and genealogies that most people skip over. Matthew's genealogy of Jesus mentions several names connected to giant bloodlines. Rahab, who helped the Israelite spies, was from Jericho, a city inhabited by giants. Some scholars believe she may have had giant ancestry herself, but the clearest reference comes from Jesus himself. In Matthew 11:23, Jesus mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. Most people know these cities were destroyed for sexual immorality, but ancient Jewish texts suggest they were also inhabited by giants. The book of Jasher, which the Bible references twice, describes the men of Sodom as being extraordinarily large and violent. judgment. When the angels came to destroy the city, the men tried to break down Lot's door. The Hebrew text suggests these weren't normal-sized men. Jude verse 6 mentions angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling. This is the same event described in Genesis 6 that created the Nephilim, but Jude writes about it in past tense, suggesting it was still relevant to first-century Christians. 2 Peter 2:4 says God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. The Greek word for hell here is Tartarus, a place where the worst criminals were kept. But here's what's disturbing. Both Peter and Jude write about these fallen angels as if their influence was still affecting the world. They weren't just talking about ancient history. They were warning about ongoing spiritual warfare connected to the giant bloodlines. Revelation 9:20 mentions demons that look like locusts with human faces, women's hair, lion's teeth, and iron breastplates. Their king is named Abaddon, which means destruction. Some Bible scholars believe these are the same demonic entities that created the original Nephilim. They're still active, still corrupting human genetics. Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward. The phrase "and also afterward" suggests they would return in the last days. We might be living in those times right now. We're advancing in technology and knowledge faster than ever before. Some Christians wonder if we're approaching the same level of advancement that existed before the flood. Jesus said the end times would be as it was in the days of Noah. What made Noah's time special? It was when fallen angels corrupted human genetics and created the Nephilim. If the end times will be like Noah's time, then genetic corruption is coming back. Throughout history, people have reported seeing strange things in the sky. Angels appeared to Abraham, Jacob, and many others in the Old Testament. Some Bible students wonder if the spiritual realm is more active today than we realize, just like it was in the days before the flood. The Bible warns that in the last days there will be a strong delusion that will deceive even the elect if possible. Could this delusion involve the return of the Nephilim? Could it involve genetic manipulation that creates a race of beings that aren't fully human? The Bible's account of giants isn't just ancient history, it's a warning for today. Throughout Scripture, giants represent rebellion against God's natural order. They show what happens when spiritual beings cross boundaries God established. Every time giants appeared in the Bible, they brought violence, corruption, and chaos. They always opposed God's people and God's plan. They were never neutral. They were always enemies of righteousness. But here's what gives us hope. God always won. Every giant race was eventually destroyed. Every corrupt bloodline was cut off. No matter how large, how strong, or how frightening these beings became, they couldn't stand against the Almighty. David killed Goliath with a stone and a sling, not because David was strong, but because God was with him. The same God who destroyed the Nephilim in the flood, who wiped out the Anakim in Canaan, who ended the Rephaim bloodlines, is still on the throne today. If giants return in our time, if genetic corruption starts again, if fallen angels attempt another rebellion, the outcome is already decided. God wins. His people win. The giants always fall. The Bible shows us that giants always opposed God's people at important moments in history. They tried to stop Abraham from inheriting the Promised Land. They fought against Israel when they entered Canaan. They challenged David when he was becoming king. The pattern is clear. Wherever God's plan moves forward, giant opposition appears. Do you think these biblical giants were real? Comment below with your thoughts and subscribe to our channel for more biblical mysteries that reveal what's really happening in our world.